I'd just like to start the morning by welcoming Dr. Al Condeluci back with us here at Community Living Kingston and District to do another session, this one on community mapping. For those of us who have had the opportunity to go to attend sessions with Al before, this will sound familiar, but for those of you who have not, I'd like to introduce Al briefly. He's, certainly what we consider to be an expert in the field of, helping people to develop community connections and the importance of relationships in people's lives. He's spent his entire career working in the field. He spent many years with an organization called CLASS in the Pittsburgh area. He is works with the universities in the Pittsburgh area and has wrote a number of books around the importance of relationships and the impacts of loneliness in lives of people with disabilities that we highly recommend. And we're lucky enough to have him on deck to do this session with us. So I'd like to welcome Al and let him take it away.
Great. Thank you, Sherry, and welcome everyone. And let me thank the folks that are on the call from cohort B that we actually had to cancel that particular session and reschedule folks from cohort B, so they fit into cohort C or with us today. So I really appreciate the flexibility. We had a death in the family, and so I had to miss that session. So thanks for the flexibility, and welcome back to our training series. This is a 6-part training series that we've launched back actually in October of 23. And the sessions, this is essentially our 4th session out of the 6 topics that we're going to be exploring. We started the program with actually general sessions where we had everybody on the call in our first 2 sessions, which were, the first session was really focusing on the history of devaluation, the history of disability, how folks with disabilities have been treated in the past and in many cases still today, and how that treatment, that devaluation treatment, especially as it manifested in institutionalization, really set the tone for people with disabilities to be offset from community, to be separated, to be marginalized. And that separation, that history of institutionalization had a powerful effect on separation in 2 ways. Obviously, for people with disabilities themselves that were institutionalized, those folks were separated out and segregated out from the greater community. That sort of led to a disconnection, an isolation, certainly a loneliness that many folks with disabilities experienced in those large Gothic institutions that we ran. But the other reality of that era of devaluation and institutionalization, also really shaped the consciousness of community, of our present day community, where our present day community really began to think that people with disabilities really perhaps are better off when they're somewhere else. And literally that people in community really don't have relevance to folks with disabilities, or don't understand them, or can't really play a role. And so as we as a system started to deinstitutionalize folks with disabilities and began to create more community-based opportunity. Our agency's name is Community Living Kingston. So as we began to look at trying to get people back into community, repatriated into community, the primary focus was then how can people begin to build relationships, right? That repatriation, if you will, of folks with disabilities who were offset because of institutionalization. Now we're coming back and really looking at building relationships. So our third session focused in on social capital, right? Which is another term or a way of thinking about relationships. And we spent the sessions, our third session, focusing on social capital, describing it, trying to really talk about how we might be able to what social capital does and can do for people, um, and how it can really address loneliness and isolation, because that is the answer to loneliness and isolation is building relationships. And so that gets us to our session today, which is really focusing in on community and community mapping, right? How can we get people connected back to community through things they're interested in? And how might we find those those community resources, right? And so this is really the shift in our presentation from micro to macro, right? And I've talked a lot in our previous sessions about that paradigm shift of thinking about things in a micro way, that is thinking about the person experiencing the disability or dealing with loneliness or struggling with social isolation, thinking about them individually. That's a microscopic kind of a perspective. um, this session shifts us into this focus on macro. How can we come to understand our communities? What are the resources in our communities? What are the places and spaces where folks that we support might be able to engage in their effort to build social capital? And also in our effort to really begin to reshape the thinking of community and to really begin to get community to think more inclusively and in a more hospitable way that welcomes everyone, right? And so as we focus in today on community mapping, I'm going to go over some content. I'm going to describe it. We're going to talk a little bit about what are the various components of community, what makes up community. Um, and as we go through this content, if you have any questions or if anything is really either unclear or you'd like to better understand it, jot that question down in the chat room. Okay, we'll use the chat room to collect some of these questions, because after we get through some of the basic content on community mapping, we'll pause and we'll Sherry and Rob will go through those questions and we'll engage around those. Okay? Once we answer those initial questions that you have, we'll continue on with the content, finishing up the focus on the content, and then really getting into a discussion in our learning circle rooms. We have 5 rooms. So we have 5 groups that are going to gather. We have trigger questions, much like we did the last session. If you remember, in the last session, we had 5 groups that actually processed the question. We're going to do the same kind of format today. And we'll give 20 minutes or so for the exploration of the question. And then we'll come back into a reconciliation, which will which will be the results of the discussion. Each group will have a chance to report out their conversation that around the trigger question that they were assigned. Okay, so with that in mind, let's begin this sort of exploration of community and of community mapping. The word community is really an interesting amalgamation of two themes, right? It's a Latin word. Cum means with, unity means togetherness. And so it really is this image of coming together around something that people find important to them, right? And there's a sense of deliberation about that and solving of things and and so the word community just implies other people. It implies togetherness. However, when we say the word community, when people think about that word, there's a lot of, knee jerk reactions, right? And one of the biggest knee jerk reactions is that community is, where I live, or community is geographic. And that's true. Community does have, in some cases, a geographic component. But also, community can be other kinds of things, other kinds of places and spaces, both indoor, outdoor, that constitute a collection of people. Right? And this little image that you see on the slide, just kind of like almost a picture graph of various pieces and components of this notion of community. Next slide, please, Sherry. So here's an interesting definition. This is from Peter Block, and Peter Block is a visionary thinker about community. He's practices in Cincinnati, Ohio, and he's written extensively about community. This quote comes from one of Block's books that I really relish. It's a book called Belonging to Community, and it came out in the early 2000s. But Peter Block in that book said, community is the container within which our longing to be is fulfilled, our longing to be. And what Block, eloquently writes about and focuses in is that all people have a longing to be, right? That none of us are good by ourselves. That if we're by ourselves, that the manifestation of who we are is muted, and actually, when we're by ourselves, that actually is punishment, right? Solitary confinement. You get in your room until you behave like we ask you to or expect you to. That notion of we separate you out from us, right? That's that individuality, that sort of that notion of just me is countered by our longing to be. Because Block goes on to say, without connectedness of community, we will continue to choose not to be, right? And so with this spirit, we talk about the places and spaces where we become something, when we're shaped in other ways over and above how we see ourselves individually. Next slide, please. Now, in our previous session, we talked about, in terms of relationship building, that there are 4 steps, right? We introduced this last time we met. And the first step is the discovery of assets, right? Cultural profile that we went over the last time we met. We introduced you to this idea of a cultural profile, which is, this discovery of who we are, of who the persons we support are. The second step in relationship building is really exploration of community. Like, what is out there that corresponds to what we care about and what we're interested in, right? And that's the mapping process. That's our topic for today. And then there are 2 other component parts that we'll cover our next session and our last session. And that is, the third piece is, once people gather together, what's expected of them? What is the infrastructure of community? Next session, we're going to really focus in on that. And then Um, Finally, and maybe most importantly, who can help us become known? Who can help us become a part of that community gathering? We call that the gatekeeper, right? The person who opens up the gate and welcomes us in. We'll get into that in our last session. And so these steps really set a like an algorithm, if you will, or a stepstone to building community. So next slide, please. This idea of community, right? That very first knee-jerk reaction is that community is geography. And community is, in some cases, geography. If you think about where you live right now, your community, what constitutes that community, right? Now, you live in a neighborhood, which is a sub-component part of a community, and that community probably has a name. You know, obviously, in a bigger way, you know, we talk about Kingston, right, as a community, but there are subsections of Kingston. I live in Pittsburgh, but my own, you know, neighborhood is called McKees Rocks, right? It's a subcomponent part of Pittsburgh, right? And it has its own unique flavor and essence. It has its own reputation. It has, you know, so community has a lot of different features to it. Some of them are geographic. Others are really much more esoteric. Next slide, please. So Einstein famously said, the significant problems we face today cannot be solved at the same level we were at when we created them, right? And I love this quote because for me, this quote really begins to challenge us to find the right paradigm, right? This gets me back to my micro macro, you know, points that I made earlier as we started today, right? That when we think about folks with disabilities and the history of how people with disabilities were treated, we see devaluation, we see offsetedness, we see institutionalization, right? And that and those things created a really challenge and a problem. So here we are now, Community Living Kingston, in our 70th year in service to the community, with the challenge of getting people more engaged in community, right? And that really requires a different paradigm. Just as Einstein said that, you know, the paradigm of linear thinking science really gave way to the need to understand quantum science in order to solve the bigger challenges that science presents to us, right? So that's a shift from linear thinking to quantum thinking. For us, it's a shift from micro thinking to macro thinking. Next slide, please. Margaret Mead, another one of my, you know, really one of the heroes of anthropology, said if we are to achieve a richer culture, rich in contrasting values. Now, this is an interesting point because what Mead is suggesting is that what creates richness in culture is diversity, right? Is difference, is contrasting values, right? We must recognize the whole gamut of human possibilities and so weave a less arbitrary social fabric and to one in which each diverse human gift will find a fitting place. That's a beautiful sentiment about inclusivity and about acceptance and respect. It really is a term, or it's a quote that actually introduces a concept called cultural humility, right? And now, cultural humility is this notion that, you know, your unique sort of culture that you came from and that you sort of, you know, grew up with gets gets, set next to somebody else's culture, right? And so cultural humility is this ability to recognize that the culture that you came from or that I came from is not the only culture. It's not the only piece of the puzzle of community. Right? It's just one piece of that puzzle community. And what Mead is suggesting is that when we begin to weave these contrasting things together, these differences together, we get this much more beautiful whole element of community. I liken it to a placemat, right? I'm sitting here at a dining room table. Look at this. This is a placemat that I have here, and you can see, uh, the placemat up here has fibers, right? And there's blue fibers, and there's white fibers, and there's beige fibers, right? And and those fibers are all woven together to create this placemat, which is solid and strong. But if I began to pull out one of these fibers, just because I don't like blue or because I don't like beige or what, I pull that fiber out of the placemat, what actually becomes happen is the placemat starts to tatter and the placemat becomes weaker. And ultimately, the placemat falls apart, right? If we pull too many pieces out. And so, what Mead is arguing is this fabric of community, is this woven um, acceptance of uniquenesses. Okay? Next slide, please. So, when we begin to talk about community mapping and we look at it now strategically, begin to say, how can we begin to map our communities and find the resources? There's basically two tracks that you can utilize community mapping. The first track is an inside out track. This is the track we're going to utilize more often than not in the work that we're doing at Community Living Kingston, right? And this is when you start with a target person. So we start with somebody that you're already serving through your organization, and you identify or you discover their interests and using a cultural profile or what other, a conversation, or you talk to their mom, or you somehow, some way begin to find out who they are, what do they care about, talking with them, right? And then you begin to say, okay, I discovered that, Al Condeluci, and talking with him, really loves music and he likes to read, and he's really interested in politics, right? And so I discovered that about Al Condeluci in a conversation or in doing a cultural profile. So we say, okay, we know these things now about Al. So what can we find in the community that would match what Al likes? Might we be able to find, some places of music, or might we be able to find some places of reading or discovery? Might we find some places that have some political, um, interest, right? So that's an inside out perspective where we start with the people we're serving, and then we go and discover in community what matches. Now, there is also another methodology that can be utilized, and this is the outside in approach, where we start with the community, right? And so we take a community like McKees Rocks, and we begin to explore that community, and we take note of, and we develop, a notebook full of the resources, the various places and spaces where people gather in McKees Rocks, right? And then we, with that listing of all the things in McKees Rocks, We sit down with Al and we say, Al, we found all these things in McKees Rocks. Does any of these interest you? Would you like any of these things? Right? Now that's an outside in perspective, right? Now in our process in community living Kingston, we're gonna lean toward the inside out. So we're gonna start with the people that we're supporting, but we're also going to use some variations of the outside in. That is, as you're going around your community, as you just live as a citizen in Kingston, you come to discover lots of things that are going on there, right? We want to know about that, right? So we want to get that stuff in our database, because it might be that someone, some family might come to Community Living Kingston and and might be interested in something you've already found, right? And that's a good thing. We're to use any methodology we can to get people engaged and to get people connected. So the outside in or the inside out are just two strategies, and agencies have used both. I think I mentioned in one of our previous sessions that I'm working with an organization in Ottawa, right, called the ODAN, the Ottawa Developmental Activities Network. And essentially, there are 18 agencies that serve people with disabilities. And so we launched a project last year to get each of these 18 agencies to explore 18 different communities in Ottawa and to just begin to examine what's out there, right? And capture that information for a database so that then the organizations can use that database to get people connected to things that match, right? Next slide, please, Sherry. So what is community mapping, right? Community mapping, okay, good. My wife is leaving, so have a good lunch. Um, okay. Okay. I'll text you. Okay. Yeah. We'll do, if she starts barking, we'll just deal with it. So, yeah. 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 Okay. Well, I'll send you some stuff. So, so in any event, community mapping is actually a human service strategy that was developed and initiated, in the 80s, 90s, because mostly for civic purposes, right? And and essentially, when you think about a micro macro thing, how community mapping actually started was when communities began to think about problems that they had, um, for example, gangs or drugs or vagrancy or homelessness, right? So communities began to identify that they had problems, right? And they started to explore the problems that they had, right? But what some really forward thinking community builders began to say is, wait a second, rather than just think about communities from their problems, why can't we look at a community through its assets, through what it has going for it? And even blighted communities or communities that are really struggling economically have this wealth of things that are happening that are really positive. And so it's just a mindset. Do you see a community for its problems, or do you see a community for its assets? Um, and so community mapping was developed as a strategy to discover assets in communities. And at Northwestern University in Chicago was really where some of the really initial research and study went into this whole idea of community mapping. And so the notion of communities looking for the good points of those communities initiated there. But it's actually a process by which we come to discover elements of community. And it can result in listing. That's my dog, Yeddle. Yeddle. She can't hear very well. Hold on one second. Okay, she just moved. Okay. So it's a process we come to discover the elements of community, resulting in listing, identifying, and codifying those places and spaces where people gather, right? And so next slide, please, begins to focus in a little bit more on this. So there are steps in general community mapping, right? And so if you look at these bullets, you'll see the process, the community mapping process, as it's taught or as it's introduced in academia, right? So step one, you define the community that you're interested in, or the population, the boundaries, the elements of that community. Step two, you convene a core mapping group. That is, you gather people who actually go out and begin to gather the data. Step three, you get that group organized. You get them to understand community mapping. That's what we're doing right now, is we're just getting organized in terms of this process. Step 3 or 4, you select an asset inventory methodology, right? An asset inventory methodology. And I'll get into this in just a moment to talk a little bit about how we gather the information, right? And there's a number of different ways that you can explore a community. You could just go out and walk around and observe, take pictures, identify things. You could talk to people in community to gather information. You can Google things. You can actually use computer-based methodologies. Even something like Google Mapping, which basically takes pictures of community and get a sense of the physicality of community. Whatever methodology you use, you gather the information, right? And then, the step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is we begin to create a database. Right? We take that information, we codify it, we put it in some form that we can go back to, that we can look at, that we can utilize. And then we activate that information with a target group. So that's just an academic overview of the mapping phenomena. And again, depending, whatever you might be interested in, you can use this kind of methodology. For us, our interest is, where are the places and spaces where people gather to celebrate something, or to do something, or to engage in something, right? And that is to find the essence of community. Next slide, please. Now, this is a 30,000-foot view of what we mean when we say community, right? Because there's lots of different component parts, lots of moving parts to this thing we call community, right? There are clubs and associations, there's institutions, there's common space, there's indoor space, there's outdoor space, there are formal groups, there are informal groups, there's economy, there's an essence of how individuals parlay their interests in doing something in their gathering point. So what I want to do is I'm going to overview these dimensions just to explain what they mean, or to just give you some picture in your head where you can kind of put together what that actually means. Once we finish this overview, we're going to open it up to any questions you have, and then we'll proceed from there. So next slide, please, Sherry. So this is just an example of associations. And this is not a totally exhaustive list. There's other things that might fit, but this just gives you some picture of when we say associations, what do we mean, right? Animal care groups, business organizations, JC's, Better Business Bureau, charitable groups in community, groups that have a particular, agenda of making the community a little bit better. Civic event groups. Every community has some kind of celebrations that it does. And there are groups of people who come together to plan the celebration. In Pittsburgh, we have a big arts festival that we run every year. And the arts festival is in June in the city, right in downtown area of the Pittsburgh. And but there's a Three Rivers Arts Festival event planning group that meets all year long in planning that event. And the minute that the festival is over, they're starting to plan for next year's festival. So it's a formal group. They have funding. They meet on a regular basis. They have volunteers, all kinds of volunteers who play a role in that. Okay? So it's an event oriented group. We have churches, and churches are interesting for a variety of reasons in community. First off, there's lots of them in community, but most churches have two sort of agendas, right? One agenda is their own theological, piece of the puzzle. So they'll do things that promote their particular theology, right? Community things that they'll do. But most churches also host other groups and other things in community. Churches see themselves as, important community members. And they want people, of course, to join their church. But on the other side of the coin is they want to do things that would just be good for their community generally. Most churches are like that. So churches really represent a really interesting target. And when we get into a little bit of the info gathering, when we discover a church, we not only want to look at what do they do in that church themselves, Bible reading, or maybe they have a food pantry or whatever, and then what other groups use that church for their own purposes, and what are those purposes? And again, all of this is to discover some things that might match somebody we serve who might have a similar interest, and that creates a stepstone to that community group. So there are educational groups, elderly groups, environmental groups. Those are the associations. Next slide, please. Here we have institutions, right? And institutions include schools, parochial or public, universities, colleges, and schools and universities are again also interesting because they have their own agenda, but they also serve their greater community. And so here you also find things that are going on in that particular setting that might be, not be something that the university actually does itself, but the university makes space for this to happen, right? So hospitals, libraries are really amazing resources in community because, libraries have gone through some really interesting changes. They used to be, of course, places where people would take out books, and they still do that. But that's just one of many things now that libraries do. libraries are really becoming such important public spaces for newcomers in community. Um, that classes that are offered there, and things that happen, computers that are available, other kinds of things that people can take advantage of in that general community. Museums similarly do things, not just for the museum, but for the community. A lot of time, classes, volunteer opportunities, all kinds of different things that might be part of a thing we call a museum. Fire and police departments, the same. Next slide, please. So here's clubs and groups that are part of community. Book clubs, Chapters Bookstore certainly hosts book clubs. But also book clubs, are things that are a little bit more informal. Some of them are formal, some are a little more informal, right? Where groups of people gather at a bar or tavern or a cafe, and they have coffee and they talk about a book. And it's not like some kind of an official club, although it could be, right? That's why we have to be real. We have to take our blinders off when we look at community and really think about it in a really creative way. Like, what is there and what might match? Special interest groups that gather in community. Coffee clatches, people who just gather every morning at Tim Hortons for coffee, and it's the same people every morning there. And it's not like some kind of an official club, like, how do I join? Can I have a membership form? I want to come and join, the Tim Hortons Coffee Club, right? I mean, it's, there are people that get invited to come in that sort of hang out. I mean, this is how we have to think when we're focusing in on community. Block clubs. A lot of communities now have block clubs that are designed, certainly for safety and for upkeep of community, but also they do rotating meals, and they'll, sponsor recreation things, and people get together for a whole variety of reasons. Affinity groups and religious clubs that can meet, leagues that gather in community. These are all, some are formal, some are informal. Next slide, please. And these are examples of both physical and outdoor gathering places. Dog parks are really kind of an interesting place where people gather on pretty predictable schedules, at a dog park to walk their dogs, right? And the notion of, if you're interested in dogs, maybe you don't even have a dog, but you're interested in dogs, hanging out at a dog park where you get to meet people who come on a regular basis, pretty predictable basis, to walk their dogs. And, dogs are, it's just an amazing, when you think about dogs. I mean, I'm looking over at my dog right now on the couch, and, we go down to visit our daughter often, and we bring our dog with us when we go. And so she has more frequent flyer miles than I do. But when I'm at the airport with our dog, with her name is Yiddle, right? She's a little Morkie, right? Maltese, Yorkshire mix. And she's older now. She's 15 years old. She doesn't have teeth. We had to have all her teeth pulled, and she has difficulty seeing and hearing, but she can smell like nobody's business. So we'll be at the airport, and I'll be walking, with her at the airport, and people just light up, and they want, they'll come over. Hi, wow, what a cute dog. What's her name? Can I pet her? And I mean, these kinds of, one of the most challenging things that we face in getting people engaged is small talk and beginning the early interfaces. So thinking about ways that people can easily penetrate into a community becomes important in our work, right? So literally both these indoor and these outdoor spaces, coffee shops, diners, cafes, community centers, rec centers. These are just amazing resources. Give an example. I did some work with Community Living Mississauga, right, which is one of your brother sister agencies in Mississauga part of the greater Toronto area, right? And we did a lot of training with their staff, a lot of community engagement training. And so one of the things that they did as a follow-up after we finished the training is they started to connect with the rec center in Mississauga, and it really began to find some receptivity. The rec center wanted to, they have resources, they get funding to have things, and they want to make sure that they're successful, that they have a lot of people who are taking advantage of their stuff. And so what we did for Community Living Mississauga is we sat with the leadership of the rec center and said, gee, we got a lot of folks, we know a lot of folks who would really be interested in a lot of things you're doing. But we want to just make sure that you're comfortable, because some of these folks use equipment or they use wheelchair. So we did a whole training series with their staff and with their volunteers who both run the programs that they do or help with the programs that they do. And I did the training actually that was not only about understanding disability, but also about adaptiveness of sports. How you can take a particular either sport or activity that was being highlighted at the rec center and have that activity, be generically comfortable for anybody. How you might adjust or alter how people who might not be able to do all elements of the particular recreation task still participate, right? And they were so open to this. They were just so willing and hungry because they want more people to take advantage of what they do, right? So literally tapping into this in these kinds of places become, I think, a part of the whole community mapping exercise. And so recognize that there's lots of elements of community, both formal, informal, tangible, intangible, that make up this thing we call community. Next slide, please. Local economy. These are some of the other places in community that actually might play a role in some way, shape, or form based on how creative we are, right? The businesses in our community and merchants and the Chamber of Commerce wants to really make sure that the businesses in the community are successful. And we represent people who have some economic impact, right? That are willing to participate, want to buy, have some resources. So the notion of inclusivity is really an economic engine, right? I mean, it helps community with what community expresses an interest in. So just knowing and thinking about some of these kinds of places and spaces begin hopefully to unlock some possibilities with the folks that we serve. Next slide, please. And so last of the listing are these just examples of other kinds of things that constitute this amazing amalgamation of places and spaces we call community. Daycare centers, and art galleries, and bowling alleys, and theaters, and historical societies that are unique to a particular part of that community. Restaurants and cafes and bakeries, and all of these things represent possibilities, right? And so this overview was just trying to unlock our thinking when we think about, or when we begin to plan for more community engagement, what that actually means. Next slide. And so this idea of community engagement is now, how do we align, people that we care about and that we support and that we're obligated to, that we're paid to actually support? How do we get those people included, invested, and engaged in some of these things? Okay? So I'm going to pause right now, and open up to. I'm going to ask Sherry if any questions have unfolded in the chat room as I was going through some of this definition and description of community and community mapping. Is there anything that's popped up, Sherry, in the chat room that folks might be interested in or have some thoughts about?
Not seeing anything in the chat, but certainly if anybody would like to unmute
Yeah.
and ask a
Raise your
question,
hand.
yeah,
Right.
we're welcome to have them.
Right. Just want to make sure that content wise, A, this is making sense. B, that you're now beginning to maybe think a little bit more about how the dots connect with somebody that you're supporting, and the greater community that they live in, that they're from, that they're a part of. So any questions or comments even that you might have on any of the content that we've covered up till now? Just going to give an awkward opportunity for pause.
I think Caroline, I saw you unmuted.
Yeah.
Did you have a comment? Yeah, go
Yeah, I was
ahead.
just going to raise my hand. Yeah, I think what I really liked that you talked about was how the example of Mississauga, where they went to the rec center and they educated people there. I think that's really important. I know certainly I work with DSLG, and we are getting people out and getting them more and more engaged. And we are looking at some individuals and trying to map who they are to their interest to the community. But it's that education of the community and respecting them where they're at and trying to work with them so it's a positive outcome for everybody. I really like that approach, and certainly something I'll be considering with my teams.
Yeah, Caroline, that's such a good point. And the really kind of neat thing here is that in many cases we're representing, people who will make community more successful, and to make it more vibrant, and just to make it more colorful, right? That those kinds of things, and this was, when Community Living Mississauga, engaged with the rec center. There was some initial thoughts that people had. Well, maybe they'll be resistant because they don't want the challenge or the problem or maybe the cost or whatever the encumbrance might be to have folks with disabilities participate side by side, or even the liability, right? That notion that somehow, some way, if a person with disability gets hurt doing something, the rec center is exposed, and consequently, so there was an initial sort of sense that we're gonna get some, resistance. And actually, it was exactly the opposite. It was almost like, the rec center said, gee, we want to, we never thought about this, but we thought those folks with disabilities did their own things with Special Olympics, or did their own things with this group, or did their own things with that group, that we never really thought about this. And it opened up an entirely new population, right?
Mhm.
To support, to serve, and to be, to get their pats on the back for that. We
Right.
serve all the community, and so they were really open, and it led way then to conducting these conversations, that were not about teaching them about disability, but just really expanding some thinking about how can the archery class, how can
Right.
the archery class incorporate some folks who might really be interested in that? Maybe they may not be able to actually shoot the arrow, but can't. And by the way, they came up with ways that folks could shoot the arrow, um, because there are all these adaptive and adjustments that are available to make something happen. We had a similar situation here in Pittsburgh, right? We were supporting a family and a daughter that had Down syndrome that wanted to be a ballerina, right? That's what she wanted, to be a ballerina. And so our support people, we call them community partners, right, who are working with people to try to get them engaged in what they're interested in the community, went to the Pittsburgh Ballet Theater, right, and 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 and, and so met with one of the leaders of the Pittsburgh Ballet Theater, and the person said, well, I thought that the ARC, the association, ARC, they're
Right.
called ARC now. Um, I thought they, you know, taught ballet, dancing and other things for their kids. And he said, well, no, I mean they have some things, but she'd like to just be with other ballerinas, right? Other young dancers who want to be ballerinas, and it was almost like the Pittsburgh Ballet Theater, the leaders there told my staff, "Wow, like we never thought that there would be. We don't know how. How do we communicate with them? Those kinds of things started to come up, and they're innocent. They're not malicious inquiries.
Mhm.
They're innocent because for years the Pittsburgh Ballet Theater thought that the ARC handled the Down syndrome ballet dancers. That's what they do, and and so there's this interesting sort of, we're at an interesting juncture here because we did do stuff like that, right? We did do special programs, special camping programs, special this program, special that program for folks with disabilities for all those years. So the generic, community resource just never thought that this was something that they could do or should do. And so embracing that challenge in a soft way, in a really win-win kind of a way, that this is not taking business away from someone else. And this is creating more holistic community for all of us. So I think that's the challenge. And Caroline, you hit it perfectly when you brought that up, because I think that's what we're going to encounter in some of this as we move
Absolutely.
forward, certainly with Community Living Kingston or with any other organization that's thinking about true community engagement. And um, and and that with the Pittsburgh Ballet situation, this this young girl who got involved, I mean, created such a I mean, it really just broadened the image Pittsburgh Ballet Theater so much. It was, I mean, they took pictures, and she was incorporated in brochures that they had, and it wasn't like they were trying to, show like a pity thing, or yeah, it was truly, I think, they're living up to their mission of people interested in ballet. And this is the resource in Pittsburgh for folks interested in ballet. So I think that this is the challenge that we're going to find as we begin to take the ship down these waters, right? But excellent point, Caroline. I really appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah, thank
Any
you.
other any other thoughts about this broadening of what community could be and might look like, in an inclusive world where anybody and everybody is welcome to participate?
We have a comment in the chat, Al, from Alicia, that identified how they related to the inside out mapping when they do planning in their work, because they use an interest checklist with the person served, and then that kind of helps to kind of guide the work as they move forward and search out what's available in the community.
Yeah, I mean, I think a hybrid situation is really the best on this inside out, outside in, a phenomena, because I mean, we're getting engaged, and we're in this training series, we've actually looked at, okay, we're going to do a discovery with a cultural profile of what somebody is really interested in, and that leads way now to how can we find groups of people who are interested in fishing, right? Or whatever the interest that the person expresses. I told the story last week with our session. I was doing a training session in Boston, and it was on community engagement, community building, and so I I introduced, I was introducing the audience, and there was maybe about 50, 60 people it was a workshop. And I had it on my computer. I had access to the internet, right? So I told, I asked folks, I did a little exercise. I said, I'd like you to write down 3 things that you're interested in. Um, just jot them down that you would like to know more about, or you'd like to, somehow, some way, get more connected to, right? So, people started writing down their things, and I said, okay, I need a volunteer because I want to demonstrate something. Right? And so this woman raised her hand, and I said, great, what's your name? And she said, my name's Gloria. I said, Gloria, nice to meet you. I said, what 3 things did you identify? And she said, well, I didn't actually get the 3. I only had 1. And it wasn't actually for me. It was for my son. Right. And I said, well, tell us about your son. She said, well, his name is Paul, and he's 24 years old, and he's stuck at home. And she said, I came to this workshop because I there got to be something more. He's such a vibrant guy, and he's just stuck at home. He does nothing. Right. And I said, okay, well, what did you identify? And she said, well, he loves Matchbox cars. Matchbox cars. And I said, Matchbox cars? I said, and she said, yeah, they're the little like cars, and they're true to life. They're, the appointments on them, they look exactly like a replica of a car, right? And I said, oh, wow, I don't know much about Matchbox cars, but that's great. Let's take that and let's try. Let's do an exercise with it. And so I had my computer there, and it was connected to a screen, and so I got on the internet, and I went to meetup.com, MEETUP, meetup.com. It's a social networking website, right? It's a database, and it's international. It has data of groups, clubs, and associations that have registered with meetup.com, right? So I typed in, I asked Gloria what her postal code or zip code is. And she told me, and the meetup.com, you have to put in a postal code because it's geographically ordered, and they have the information of stuff going on in the community tied to, postal codes. So I typed her postal code in and I said, okay. And then on the keyword bar search, I typed in Matchbox cars, right? Matchbox cars. And up came 3 hits, right? In the geographic area of Boston that Gloria and Paul lived in, right? And and these were clubs. They weren't disability groups, and they weren't kids groups. They were adult clubs of adult, mostly men, who collected Matchbox cars, and that they had like these festivals, and they competed where people would bring their cars and they compared them, and they had judges. And I mean, I never knew such a thing existed until I find it, on the Matchbox, on meetup.com. So there are sometimes resources in community that might not even be registered, and discovering them, finding them, is really what community mapping is about. And meetup.com is one particular strategy that we could use. So if we discover that somebody that we're supporting likes something, yeah, we use it all the time. We still use it all the time in my organization. We supported a guy who was had a traumatic brain injury, and his brain injury was really pretty devastating. And it was an automobile accident, and he now, uses a chair, has real difficulty speaking, the vision field cut. It's pretty challenging situation. And when we met him and we did the discovery, the cultural profile, he identified fishing. He wanted to get involved in fishing. So our staff support person, his name was Doug. Doug went into meetup.com and discovered the Three Rivers Fishing Club. And it's a fishing club that meets, once a week in downtown Pittsburgh, right by, our baseball field. It's called PNC Park. And they have lunch. They on nice days, on days that people might be interested in fishing, they take their lunch. They kick in money. They pay a kid to bring the tackle boxes and the fishing rods. And these are like lawyers and accountants, and they'll take their lunch. The kid brings pizza. People have pizza and they'll fish, for an hour, at lunchtime, right? So, we got Carl involved in this fishing club, right? Who knew? Who knew that there was such a thing, right? It was on meetup.com. So in fact, if we get back to the content, Sherry, I have a slide that illustrates some of the ways we can discover in community. Right? Certainly, we know that we're creative. We are the most creative species on the planet, right? Our imagination and our subtleties and really, make us creative enough to find places. So next slide, please. So here's how we might begin to try to find what's out there in community. Examine printed material. There's a lot of things already gathered information. In fact, we started to do this in Sault Ste. Marie a couple years ago with Community Living Algoma. And one of the things we discovered when we started mapping was that there already were inventories out there that had been assembled for other reasons that already did some of this work. For example, the mayor's office in Sault Ste. Marie created a a booklet that was what they wanted to use to welcome immigrants to their community. And so it was loaded with places and spaces in community that they gave out to newcomers coming to their community. There was already things gathered in that particular effort that was done by city council to make Sault Ste. Marie a more welcoming community. Another thing that happened in Sault Ste. Marie is that we discovered that the rec centers, and I think this would be true in almost every community, that the rec centers already have listings of classes that they teach or things that they do each semester at the rec center. And sometimes some of this might be on the web, sometimes it's produced in hard copy, but they already had all these kind of classes, cooking classes, and this group, and film, groups that were interested in movies and films and photography, and all this stuff was already collected, right? So Google searches. I went up to do some training, I guess about 6-8 months ago, to Brantford, right? And to Community Living Brant, right? To work with their staff around some of these ideas. And so they, in preparing for my trip up there, they said, look, we're supporting a guy that we're really struggling to try to find some things for him to do. Would you be able to brainstorm with us? And I said, okay, tell me a little bit about the guy so I can do a little bit of homework. So they described this guy that they support. And one of the things that he was interested in that they told me was scrapping. He was interested in scrapping. And I don't know anything about scrapping. But I just Googled, scrapping in Brantford, right? Really, really low-hanging fruit here. And up came, junkyards and companies that took old, sheet metal scraps and all of these kinds of possible resources, right? So I think just Googling something, just as simple as that, begins to open up doors. It might not be a perfect match. It might not be the exact match, but it begins to, this is like being a detective in some ways, right? Examining what's going on in our community, talking to others. Who would you talk to in a community if you wanted to find out what's going on? Is there anybody in particular? Observing community, just looking at the billboards and the other kinds of things that are out there already in community tells you about that community. It tells you what's going on. It tells you some of the things that you can discover. Supermarkets and grocery stores, their bulletin boards list some things that sometimes can uncover something that might be a match, right? So I think that this idea of finding these resources is as creative as we want to be, and again, as dogged as we want to be. And that's part of this, is just looking at and trying to find the kinds of things that would help you better understand what might be a resource for somebody that we serve. And you might discover something that doesn't match with somebody that you're serving right now, But we still want to quantify that because it might match tomorrow for somebody that we meet, right? Next slide, please. So this notion of community, right? It's this sort of, in fact, I don't even know what this slide actually means. But I thought it was cool because it showed this kind of unique diversity of each person, and in some ways how some of those diversities connect, right? Align. Next slide, please. So what do we want to gather? What kind of information do we want to find? So here's some an initial overview, right? We want to see if the group has some kind of a name. Some groups do, other groups don't. The location, where do they gather? How often do they gather? And what do they do when they gather? What's expected of people when they gather? How do they dress? What time? What's the timetables? Who might be somebody in that gathering point that would be a welcome connection for us? Somebody who might be a gatekeeper. Gatekeepers, by the way, are indigenous members of community who either open or close the gates. They welcome somebody new, or they close the gates and say, not in our backyard. I don't know. No. I mean, so gatekeepers can be positive or negative. And part of our challenge, and next month, when we talk a little bit more about this concept, and certainly the month after, I'm going to actually do some exercises with you on how might we identify who would be a potential gatekeeper. And there's some things that we know about positive gatekeepers that we can look for. Right? Contact information, any other pertinent info. So next slide, I think, actually shows some data gathering forms that we have. Okay, so this is a form, a mapping overview, a template, right? And this one is just sort of generic, right? Like, what's the public space? Are there parks, gardens, rinks, playgrounds, rec centers? Like, what just generally is that community have? So this is sort of just a first swipe at starting the process of what's in my community. Next slide, please. This one begins to focus in a little bit more on those generic kinds of places like libraries or churches or rec centers, right? What are the things they do? What are the things that maybe happen there that somebody else does? They just provide the space. In fact, one of the things that we did at my agency, Community Living and Support Services, was we had a community center, where we basically, where all of our stuff was kept. And we decided that rather than it be a disability center, let's make it a community center. And so we genericized it and we opened it up for anybody to use, clubs, groups, associations who were interested in needed space to meet. We didn't even rent it. We gave it out. And groups started to utilize it. Slowly, we incorporated a small little fee. If you want coffee, we'll provide coffee to your group. We started to do some things, and then essentially now people actually rent the space. It's inexpensive, but it generates some income for our organization. So places in community can give away the space, or they can make it available. We utilized. I was starting a volleyball league in Pittsburgh, and so we initially used a place called the Pitt Tavern, the University of Pittsburgh, the Pitt Tavern, and they had meeting rooms in the back of the Pit Tavern, but you had, of course, buy your food and your drinks from the Pit Tavern, right? So that was the trade-off. And we began to have our organizing meetings at the Pit Tavern. And we created a volleyball league designed for an adaptive volleyball league designed for folks interested in volleyball. So the notion of space can also be taverns or restaurants or cafes. Lots of possibility in community when you open your mind to it. Next slide, please. So this sheet is one that drills down. Once you find a venue at the rec center or at the library, or you find a group that meets, a gardening club that meets at the garden center. I'm using this as an example because I work with a group up near Erie, Pennsylvania called A Whole Life. And we did some community mapping there. And this is the form that we actually use there. And we identified various groups, as you can see at the top, the name of the group, the activity of the group, the address, what part of town, the town was called Hermitage, what part of Hermitage did that group meet in? As you go a little further down, you see, was it handicapped accessible? Was there parking available? Did you have to pay? Were there free parking? Was there food involved in the group? So take one example. We found a gardening club called the Buell Gardening Club. It met at the Buell Mansion. The Buell Mansion. Buell was a big family that was big benefactor in the area. And the gardening club met there, right at the Buell Mansion. And so when we went to assess it, because we had some folks we supported who were interested in gardening, we wanted to, was it friendly? Was it warm? Were people supportive? Was it cold or aloof? Because groups have a personality very much like people have personalities, right? And sometimes they're a little harder to penetrate. So this really helped us sort of begin to sort of pull out some key things that helped us with our community engagement efforts in Hermitage. Next slide, please. So once we gather the data, how are we going to display it? And generally, we're going to use a database, right? An electronic database, so that you can, in your computer, go to the database, type in a keyword, gardening club, and then see what's in that database, right? But there's also other ways that info can be displayed. At Whole Life, we actually created a scrapbook. And in that scrapbook, we had pictures of the activity. So if it was a car club, if it was a gardening club, if it was a volunteer group of some sort, if it was an animal center, we put pictures that somebody who perhaps has an intellectual disability and maybe difficulty reading things that are more abstract could actually look at the pictures and get a real sense, is this something for them? Some of the pictures we used in the scrapbook were stock. Some of them were actual photos we took at the venue. So there's various ways that info can be displayed. So when you sit down with somebody and have that discussion about possibilities, persons can really make more informed choice. Next slide, please. So what's the benefits here? Why are we doing this? Well, obviously, mapping reveals possibilities, targets, places that might correspond. And once the resource is found, this is the first step of possible connection. And then becoming a member of it sets the table for it. It doesn't guarantee that relationships are going to form, but it at least sets the table. Because once relationships do form, we know that they pay huge dividends from our conversation last month on social capital. Next slide, please. So content-wise, that's community mapping. So what we're going to do now is we're going to break into some discussion groups, and we're now at 1 o'clock. We have about a half an hour. We're going to take the next 10 minutes to engender a conversation. So you'll be in one of 5 groups. If you're in group 1, you see your question. Group 2, that's your question. Group 3, your questions, who do you talk to? Group 4, group 5. Those are the questions that you're going to engage in your group. So the next slide overviews the process. When you get into your group, you're going to have a couple minutes just to think about your question privately and write down maybe some reactions to the question. And then we want you to start a conversation. Somebody in your group is going to actually play a leadership role in guiding the conversation, so everybody has a chance to weigh in on the question. We're going to ask the person who's guiding it to take notes, and at the end of the note-taking process, be able to report. Okay, so what we're going to do is a reconciliation, and this is just a quick overview of the conversation. And so what we want to do is I'm going to call on each of the groups one by one, and as the group gets called on, if the spokesperson, who was the note taker, can introduce themselves, read the question that they kicked around, and then just a little bit of reaction of, you don't have to get into everything that people said, but just a summary of the conversation. That would really be great. We can then get other aspects to that as we move through. So we're going to start with group 1. And if group 1 spokesperson can unmute and introduce themselves, and then read the question, and then we can go from there. So group 1.
Meetup.com or
What?
I don't
Sorry.
Jennifer, is it you?
I'm not sure what number my group was.
Yes.
No, we're group 2, Jen.
Are we?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's start, Jen. Since you're up and Adam, why don't you? Well, let's go to question 2, and then we'll come back to 1. Question 2.
Okay, sorry.
No worries,
okay,
Jen.
so
Go ahead.
we had beyond meetup.com. What are some other ways of identifying possible venues? And we had a really good chat. We ended up with a huge list, which was really great. So I won't list all of them, but to summarize some of them, Google was obviously our first one. Other agencies and partners. So we do that a lot of our work. We reach out to other agencies and they come to us and fill us in on events and venues and things that are happening. Church websites and groups. Talking to families. So just person served families and they let us know things that we don't know. Schools. Social media was another big one we thought about. Facebook groups have a lot of really specialized groups that you could be part of and learn more about your neighborhood, about the city. Twitter has to do with social media. We even said things like events like today. So any type of training event, but even today, just chatting with that group, we had learned things from each other, different events and venues. Yeah, so that was a neat one. And like local doctors' offices, they always have pamphlets out. So you're learning a lot of things there. And then another one we said at the very end was even just conversations within your inner circle. So like one person had an example of having dinner with some friends the other night and learning about a different group or venue that they hadn't heard of. So that's just a little bit to summarize. Lots more, but that's kind of a few good examples.
Yeah, Jen, thank you. It was really, really a good listing, and I think what you really hit it. It's just as creative as you want to be in identifying what's out there. Social media is a great example though, because there's so many things that get highlighted, and all the levels of social media as well. So not just Facebook, but you have other dimensions where things can happen. Now, the downside of social media is you don't want to go down any rabbit holes, but on the other side of the coin, identifying some things that are there can certainly be helpful. Great work, Jen. Thank you. Let's see if we can bring group one back in. Is group one, do we find the
I think
Kim?
that might be us, perhaps.
Hey,
My name
Kim,
is
why don't you
Kim.
do it?
Yep. So our question was, what potential settings might you consider if you're not sure of the person's affinities or interests? So
Yeah.
some of what Jenna had said, we kind of targeted those as well. So we thought definitely churches, because they're always very welcoming to diverse populations. And they tend to have, a lot of things in the church that our members could become involved in. Libraries was another one. Again, they offer a variety of things that our individuals can take part in. And again, they're very welcoming of anyone. Another one was sometimes folks will bring in photo albums, and even by looking at some of the pictures and seeing what activity or what place brought joy to their faces, that would be something that could maybe help us try and find something in the community for them. Again, extracurricular activities. What we said there was having an initial a planning meeting, but involving a lot of people in the meeting, so more person-centered planning. So involving a lot of people that know the individual, that can provide us with a lot of information, because sometimes the individual themselves is unable to, or by getting a whole group together, we have a lot more things that will help us try to find something for them. Even the local brochures or pamphlets that are printed up, indicating what events are happening in the community, or what sports things might be happening, and then just taking the individual out and exposing them to some new opportunities in their community, because a lot of them have never had that experience. And so how are they supposed to know if what they like if they've never experienced it? So even just taking them out.
Bingo. Kim, what a great summary. And that last point that you made is huge, because the notion of being with people is really, for most of us, the critical variable. I mean, yes, the interest area, matters, but more, what matters is being with other people, and especially if folks have had limited exposure to what might be possible. So that's an excellent point. Great summary. Thank you, Kim, from Group 1. We're going to go to Group 3 for a quick summary. So whoever is the spokesperson, if they could just weigh in, introduce themselves, and we'll get that question.
Hi, I'm Melissa. So our question was, if you want to better understand what is available in a community, who would you talk to? So kind of piggybacking on first two groups, we had a lot of like social media. So even Facebook, like there's certain groups for community bulletin boards, as well as like the local town, like they have their own Facebook page where they post a lot. And I guess like it definitely varies from community to community, but we also had like the library, there's Keys Job Center, depending on like what you're looking for. We had different restaurants and coffee shops. Like being in a small knit community, there's a lot that gets said and goes around, so word definitely travels. As well as like the local Lions Club. They're also a big part of the community and post a lot and do a lot of events in the community, so they're always a good group to go and talk to. And being a tourist town, we also have like our visitor center. So they post a lot, they are out in the community a lot, and yeah, as well. I can't remember if I said the local library, but they also
Yeah.
have a board there. So
Yeah. Yeah, Alicia, great review, and everything that you ticked off become places that could uncover resources. You know, the other thing to remember too, and especially on this question, is every community has some sage or sages who know everything that's going on there. I mean, and like for example, in my community, I live in a town called McKees Rocks, and there's a guy who runs a Italian store. His name is Ernie Ritchie, right? It's called Ritchie's Sausage. You know, like they make hot sausage and meatballs, and and they sell them. And Ernie Ritchie knows everything that's going on in this community. I mean, he's an amazing font of information. I mean, he knows what's happening, what's changed, who's new, who's not new, who's sick, who's. I mean, he knows everything that's going on in the community, and so finding those community sages become. I mean, even if you went into any community, say you were an outsider from the community and you went into a community and you just went to one of the stores, one of the shops, local shops, and just said, who's in the know here that knows what's going on informally in the community? They're going to tell you, because the sages, people know who they are. They're going to tell you it's Ernie. Go see Ernie Ritchie. so I think between the items that you identified, Alicia, that would include, some of those traditional things that are out there, it's trying to find some of those community sages who might be helpful with some ideas or maybe just some recommendations. So great. Good job, Alicia. Thanks, group 3. Let's go to group 4. Whoever the spokesperson might be, again, if you can introduce yourself and then your question. Group 4. So
Hi there.
waiting to
Sorry,
see.
I'm Tamara. I think we're group 4. So our question was what differentiates formal versus informal group. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So basically what we came up with, we used yoga as an example for one of them. And basically what we were feeling is like a formal group is something probably more so that you would sign up for, register, possibly pay for, right? It might hold people more accountable, right? To follow through with it because they've put forward that level of commitment. Maybe they partnered up with a friend. But really, I think what we thought it came down to for the difference between that and the informal is the informal is kind of more intimate, right? It may be a smaller sized group and you might be having the opportunity to connect more with people because it's a more casual setting. And so I think that's the biggest difference that we were finding. Yes, it's voluntary, so it might not have as much accountability to it unless you partnered up with a friend specifically. But yeah, that it was more lending itself to the more intimate, casual connections that felt more natural.
Great. Tamara, thank you. Great review. And you're absolutely right on with the informal versus the formal structure and formality are the things in a formal group where, you sign up, you get a membership card, perhaps you have to pay a dues there, there's more accountability, as you mentioned. The informal group, I think the perfect word for that, intimate. It's much more intimate. It is not as predictable. It is not as perhaps regular or as structured. But both types of groups are out there, and we use them as human beings. We connect with both types of groups, and sometimes the formal leads to some informal experiences. So I think that connecting in to either of them, but certainly for many of the folks we support, starting with something more formal that might lead to finding the informal. The other thing about informal and formal groups, just quickly, is that informal groups require much more, I think, what's the term I'm struggling for? Communication ability that's a little bit more intimate as well. And so if you're supporting somebody whose communication experience is limited, or maybe not as acute, or maybe their communication ability is really restricted, um, intimate groups are a little more difficult to penetrate. And once you penetrate in, then they become robust. But it's kind of getting in that starts, and so it's easier with a limited communication challenge to get into a more formal group. It's easier to do that, but the informal groups are a little bit more juicy. There's more impact from social capital in an informal group than there is in a formal group. Okay, let's go to our group 5, our last group. If we can, an introduction and then an overview of the conversation. So group 5.
Hi, I'm Taylor for group 5. So our
Okay,
question
Taylor.
was to accurately map a community, what features of venues, activities, groups should you identify? So we kind of talked about some characteristics being accessibility and the location of the group or venue. How easy is it to get there? Is it on a bus route? Inclusivity, and just having it being a respectful and welcoming environment for people to go and want to go to attend. Sense of community kind of goes with being welcoming and a safe place. And we talked about healthy and clean environment and having some flexibility for people's needs.
Yeah, great. Taylor, good job. Good conversation. That clearly putting these pieces together become the challenge in community mapping. But the ultimate goal here is that folks begin to get connected and engaged and build relationships that can be sustaining, right? Because many of the folks that we support, they go from relationship to relationship to relationship, mostly with staff, as staff come and go or get reassigned, and you know, the depth of relationships is for many people is limited, and so each of the groups, great job. These questions are thrown out to get us thinking and talking about this topic. So we're just about at the end of the session. We will be back next month with a focus on the social infrastructure. And this is, I think you're going to enjoy this session because it really is kind of looking inside a group or an organization. And so since the beginning of the human experience, people have behaved as freedom has meant more to them than their life. Yet more important is the need to belong to community. Next slide, please. Schweitzer said so eloquently, the first step in the evolution of ethics is a sense of solidarity. Ethics means treating people right, treating people fair, honestly, and the first step is really people finding their connecting pieces. Next slide. Robert Putnam said, if you belong to no community and you decide to join one, you cut your risk of dying in half over the next year. So we know communities breed life, and you know, being lonely and isolated is toxic. Next slide, please. This community is a puzzle, right? It's complex and it's unpredictable. That's one of the reasons why a lot of organizations don't do much community building, because it's hard to do, hard to predict. Next slide. So here's my contact information. As you guys know, I always leave with this information that if you have any questions or comments that we didn't get to in a general sense, that you think I could be helpful with, just drop a note. You have my email, my phone number. If you call and you don't get to me, leave a message and I'll get back to you as quickly as I can. I want to thank everybody for the flexibility again of making adjustments. If you were in our second session and you didn't have a chance to be there, thanks for flexing a bit for me. It really was helpful with my schedule. We're back next month, the month of February. We have our sessions starting on the 6th of February, going all the way through the 27th every Tuesday at 10 o'clock, except for the last session, which is at 11:30. So again, we have some homework. Sherry talked a little bit about that. If you have any questions on that, please raise them with Sherry, Rob, or anybody else on the leadership team of this training series. Other than that, I thank you guys for your participation. Look forward to seeing you again next month. Sherry, any closing parting comments?
I just wanted to thank Al for another inspiring and informative session, and thank all of you for your insights. You always learn something a little bit new each time, which I really appreciate. And as Al said, community living folks, stay tuned, and we'll share some more details about your in-between work assignments. And for those of you who have joined us from outside of community living, thanks for coming. And we'll pass along the recording and those tools and resources and the slides to you, so you'll have them as well. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Have a great week.